Welcome to our viewers in the United States and around the world. I'm Mark Agrast, Executive Director of the American Society of International Law, speaking to you from Tiller House, the Society's headquarters in Washington, D.C. Today's webcast, the third in our series on international law and the Trump administration, will feature an expert discussion on U.S. participation in global trade agreements. The American Society of International Law is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization with a worldwide membership, founded in 1906 and chartered by the U.S. Congress in 1950. Our mission is to foster the study of international law and to promote international relations on the basis of law and justice. These webcasts further that mission by providing the public with factual background and expert perspectives on the critical policy choices that will face America and the world in the coming months. Modern nations have long relied on trading relationships to sustain and grow their economies, and globalization has intensified their interdependence. Although trade agreements and regulations have often been a source of domestic controversy, they have seldom been as hotly contested as they were during the 2016 election. Since taking office, the Trump administration has taken steps to withdraw the U.S. from the proposed Transatlantic Partnership, Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and has signaled its intention to withdraw from or renegotiate a number of the free trade agreements in which the United States currently participates, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. We're fortunate to have with us today two experts who served in senior positions in Republican and Democratic administrations, where they were responsible for representing the U.S. government in trade negotiations and developing and implementing U.S. trade policy. It is now my pleasure to give the floor to our moderator, who will introduce our speakers and begin the discussion. Lucinda Lowe is the president of the American Society of International Law. She is also a partner and head of compliance, investigations, trade, and enforcement in the Washington office of Steptoe & Johnson, LLP. Lucinda Lowe.
Thank you very much, Mark. Welcome to our audience. As Mark has said, our topic today is a subject that has been much in the headlines, both during the presidential election campaign and since then, with the U.S. withdrawal from the TPP, the new administration's call for the withdrawal from a renegotiation of NAFTA, proposals for punitive border tariffs or tax benefits for companies that export products and corresponding detriments for companies that import, calls for unilateral measures to punish China for currency manipulation and other perceived unfair practices, just to name a few. We're going to talk about these today primarily from the perspective of international law, but we also want to explore the relationship that international law, trade agreements, has with our domestic laws here in the United States. With me to explore these topics are two of the most knowledgeable, experienced, and thoughtful people we could find. First, Ambassador Miriam Shapiro, who served in the administrations of Presidents Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama, most recently in the Obama administration as Deputy U.S. Trade Representative and Acting U.S. Trade Representative. She is currently a partner in the public affairs and strategic communications firm Finsbury, where she heads the Washington, D.C. office. And our second speaker, Grant Aldonis, served as the Undersecretary of Commerce in the Bush administration and on the Senate Finance Committee, a key congressional committee dealing with trade issues, as Chief International Trade Counsel. Among many other roles he plays, he chairs the International Institute of Economic Law Academy at Georgetown University Law School, in addition to having taught trade law there for a number of years. Miriam and Grant, many thanks for joining us for today's webcast. We have a lot to talk about, so let's jump right in. I'd like to start by just setting the stage a little bit. There are many different types of trade agreements, and it would be useful, I think, to talk a little bit about those, how they're alike, how they're different, and why those different types are important. Grant, maybe you could say a word about that to start us off.
Sure. And Lucinda, thank you very much first for the invitation and for ASIL doing this. It's incredibly important and timely at this point. Yeah, in terms of trade agreements, the first thing and most important thing I think for everyone to understand is they're more like contracts, and the nature of contracts is about a bargain, a balance of concessions, or a balance of advantages. And so lots of times we think we're bound by these things as opposed to thinking about it as agreements that provide mutual benefits to both sides. Now, as a part of that, you have two basic varieties. One's bilateral, one is multilateral, that has been a topic of a lot of conversation right now.
And we'll talk about that
Yeah.
some more in a moment.
And
Yeah.
one of the interesting things, I think, is that there's virtues to each one of those. But if we're thinking in terms of international law and establishing a broad framework of law that allow people to trade, the multilateral approach is the more efficient of the two, honestly, in terms of setting rules and norms.
Well, so Miriam, let's pick up on that. The president has expressed a strong preference for bilateral over multilateral instruments in this area. Why is that? Is there a concern with multilateral agreements? Are there things we can secure from them that we can't get from bilaterals?
Well, let me step back for a minute, listen. I want to say a word more generally about trade agreements and trade policy and why they're so important. As many know, trade became an issue of some anxiety during the campaign season, both the primary and the general. There was a lot of concern about stagnant wages in the U.S.,
Right.
about growing income inequality, and trade became a scapegoat, if you will, blamed for more things than it is actually even theoretically responsible for. And what this really is about, as the administration is getting settled, is how do we create more jobs? And that's the most important consideration right now, because 95% of the world's customers live outside the US. So we can't grow our economy, we can't grow jobs, we just trade with ourselves. It's just not going to work. And so the question is, really, how do we get other countries to lower the tariff and the non-tariff barriers that otherwise hinder our exports? Because the Commerce Department has estimated for roughly every $1 billion in increased exports, we can sustain or create 6,000 jobs. So there's a clear link. And other countries don't lower their barriers because we ask them to, and they're nice to us. They lower them because they have to. And as Grant said, it's because there's a legally binding obligation that's reciprocal. We may not have agreed to lower the same barriers because we may have different barriers. And in general, the US economy has far fewer barriers than other economies because we have a much more open system to start with. So these trade agreements are critical because they work in our favor. They lower barriers that our exporters, our companies, our workers would otherwise face, and that exporters from other markets don't necessarily face. So it's really an effort to level the playing field. That's why they're important. And so then you get to the question of, well, should it be a multilateral or a bilateral exercise? The administration has indicated a clear preference for bilateral agreements. Bilateral agreements are a very good thing, but they need not be mutually exclusive. You can and should consider both. And the reason is that you really have to look at the context. There may be certain situations where it makes more sense to do a bilateral agreement, and others where a multilateral or regional is much more effective. And take the TPP, for example, which you and Mark mentioned. TPP was an agreement that the US worked very hard to negotiate over 3 to 4 years, depending on how you count, maybe even 5, to reach an agreement, a very high standard agreement with 11 partners in the Asia Pacific region, including some of its closest trading partners like Japan, Mexico, and Canada. Now, as long as that took, and as complex as that agreement is, it would probably take far longer to do 11 separate bilateral agreements, and you would end up with inconsistent rules. So that is not necessarily a recipe for economic success and the kind of job growth that we want to see.
Okay, well, we'll come back to TPP a bit later and talk about it in more detail and what the consequences of withdrawal would be. Anything else you want to comment at this stage?
No, I think Miriam captured it. The main thing I always want to reinforce is we have a tendency to misunderstand that these are things that we reach at the bargaining table because they're mutually advantageous. It's not as if we're bound by something that something is forced upon us.
Right.
It's a contract.
Well, let's pick up on that idea as we turn to NAFTA,
Sure.
the North American Free Trade Agreement, a multilateral agreement because there are 3 countries
Right.
that are party to it. One of the things the new administration has pointed out is what's happened to the U.S. trading deficit with Mexico in particular since NAFTA went into effect. And if you take Miriam's example of exports create jobs, if we have a trade deficit with a country, doesn't that mean that we're losing jobs to that country? So let's talk about NAFTA a little bit. And Grant, if I could turn to you first, what was the benefit of our bargain there, and what happens if we pull out?
So thanks for the question, because when I was a diplomat, my first tour in the Foreign Service was in Mexico. And what people don't tend to think about when they think about NAFTA, negatively or positively, is that in 1980, when I was in Mexico, the Mexican government had nationalized more of its economy than the Soviet Union. So as it began to think in terms of liberalization, one of the things it thought about was, could we reach an agreement with the United States that essentially would cement in the changes in terms of opening the economy and opening economic opportunity, particularly for people at the bottom of Mexican society. So when we sat down to bargain, we were bargaining both for the advantages from the point of view of American firms being able to export to a growing market. We're also thinking very much about our southern neighbor and our broader relationship. And that's always true of trade. Trade fits in a larger context of relations and a larger fabric of a relationship mediated by international law. This is just one axis of it. But in this instance, I got to say, it's an unqualified success. If you think about the average Mexican person, as well as our ability to trade, the freedom that the agreement generated on both sides of the border was a pretty remarkable thing. We have a stable southern neighbor, despite what the president says, largely by virtue of the agreement we reached. Not just NAFTA, but at its core, it's NAFTA, and then broader. And of course, the fact that you integrated both Canada and Mexico, going to Miriam's point about the benefit of a multilateral agreement, it allowed our auto industry to rationalize on a North American basis. Anybody I know in Detroit grasped that we are competitive globally by virtue of the fact that we've rationalized this on a North American basis. We've taken the advantage that both Mexico, Canada, and the United States have together, and it's made us a much more potent force for the benefit of GM, Chrysler, Ford, and all their workers.
Well, certainly we've seen the auto industry come back from bankruptcy to
Absolutely.
record profits in recent years. So your point is an important one. But suppose the U.S. does pull out. Miriam, what does that mean?
Well, I think a couple of points. First of all, with respect to the deficit, everybody wants to run a trade surplus. But running a deficit isn't necessarily a bad thing. You have to look at the nature of it. So, for example, your exports could be growing at a significant clip, but your imports may also be growing. And some of those imports are being used to then make products for export. So you really have to look, when people talk about the trade deficit, you really have to look at what is the underlying concern. And again, have you created, or could you still create, a more level playing field that will enable U.S. exporters to really grow and prosper and not to face unfair tariffs, whether they be non-tariff barriers that you can't see. They're sometimes hidden more than you can hide a tariff barrier. So that's really the issue there with respect to deficits. I think with NAFTA, it certainly can be renegotiated. I mean, it's a decision for the parties. And the U.S. certainly could unilaterally withdraw if it wanted to, if it really believed that was in its own interest. And there really aren't that many people that think that would be a good idea. And I say that because the 3 economies are so intertwined after 20 years of having, virtually tariff-free trade. And as Grant said so well, I mean, if you look at how many times products cross the border before they're finished, I mean, with automobiles, it's about 8 times.
8 times. Yeah.
And it's become a seamless process. Can you imagine what that would do to the U.S. economy if suddenly we didn't have NAFTA? So you really have to look at it in terms of what's going to serve U.S. interests. Now, the agreement is 20 years old. It is certainly in need of an update. I mean, think back 20 years ago. I mean, there's no e-commerce chapter. How many of us were using the internet in the early 90s? Very, very few, I would think. And so it's time for an update. Ironically, TPP would have been a way to update NAFTA because it also involved Mexico and Canada, but that's not to be at this time. And so we really need to look at how do we improve the agreement, keeping in mind that each country is going to have demands, not just the U.S. And a negotiation,
Exactly right.
a negotiation is a give and take, or we're not going to get to an agreement. So
Right.
we have to prioritize. And I hope the administration is starting to do that. Think about really what is most important objective here. What do we want to try to fix? And what are the other countries going to come to the table and ask for? And where can we find a common ground so that we can, in the end up with a successful negotiation?
Just to reinforce that point, Lucinda, one of the interesting areas, because of the intervening 20 years, going on 25 years, is energy. Where at the time we negotiated the NAFTA, frankly, it was a national enterprise in Mexico,
Right.
which President Peña Nieto did change in terms of amending the Constitution to liberalize in Mexico's interest. For our part, we've gotten rid of our restraint on oil exports, and we've had an energy revolution of our own. The same thing has happened in Canada. One thing that's worth looking at is that there's a real opportunity on both energy and its counterpart, the environment, in this context, where we have moved a great distance in terms of our own thinking nationally, as well as Mexico and Canada, and what we could do together in both these spaces, which are so closely intertwined. So to Miriam's point, there's a lot of positive things we could do by renegotiating NAFTA. If you start from the assumption that what you're really trying to do is separate yourself from NAFTA, it's a net loser for American workers.
Exactly. And if I could add, Grant raises a great point about energy. We do import a fair amount of energy from both Mexico and Canada, and then we refine it and often re-export it. But if you actually look at the trade that we have with the 20 countries we now have trade agreements with, and you take out oil, we actually have a surplus. The last estimate I saw from Commerce, it was about $12 billion. So again, that goes back to your question about a deficit.
Right.
It depends what piece of the picture you look at.
That's very interesting. Well, let me just ask, what's the extent of the president's authority here? I mean, NAFTA was done under fast track authority. Congress had a role. If we're talking about renegotiation or unwinding in some way, what's the president's authority in this area?
It's a great question, Lucinda, because we fought a revolution over taxes. And as a consequence, in the Constitution, we put the power over taxation, which was all duties at the time, it was all import tariffs, in the body that's closest to the people. So any revenue measure, including any trade measure, has to start in the House of Representatives under the Constitution. It is their exclusive authority. Now, to equilibrate the powers between the president, who is the sole voice in negotiating on behalf of the United States, and the power of Congress to regulate, we always have had to find an accommodation of sorts. Beginning with Roosevelt, we started to engage in delegations of authority. So with NAFTA, one of the interesting things is that there's residual authority for some changes that still lodges with the president. Of course, he has his foreign affairs power, which will allow him to withdraw. What he can't do is change the law of the United States. That has to go back to Congress. And in implementing the NAFTA, we did make a series of changes in American law. So the odd thing about withdrawing from NAFTA is it would put us in the odd position where we were no longer owed the obligations by Mexico and Canada, but we're still forced to comply by virtue of our own law. And that really is the interplay between the Congress's authority and the president's authority. That's why the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee have invited the president's representatives up to talk about how the renegotiation will go and to insist that we'll be under the fast track process. And that will really require negotiations with all of the different interests, which Miriam is very familiar with, that come in the context of a negotiation, so that we get to a point, because Congress wants their constituents heard. This is their authority. They want their constituents heard. And USTR is this unique body which is designed really to hit this balance. And so really what the Congress was doing in its conversations with the administration really was reasserting its constitutional prerogatives and demanding that this flow through the process. Well, ultimately, if it's going through fast track, you're headed toward a vote at some point on any new renegotiation, which you would expect if we're doing further liberalizing, as Miriam had suggested we could under this arrangement. But it is this interesting push and pull we always have in the foreign affairs area between Congress's power and the power of the president.
So it's complicated. And what about the WTO? I mean, what do the multilateral, writ large trade rules have to do with this whole discussion?
Well, we are a member of the WTO in good standing. Many people want to see that continue. We benefit greatly from the multilateral agreements that we are party to, from the plurilateral agreements, which are those that involve less than all of the members of the WTO. But for example, recently we successfully concluded the Information Technology Agreement, the ITA, which updated an old agreement that was about 15 years old. And again, because of the internet, the economies of all of the members of the ITA and all of the WTO members, for that matter, have changed so drastically that it was really time for an update. And it was a breakthrough that we were able to reduce tariffs on a whole range of goods that involve technology that hadn't even been invented 15 years ago.
It's odd, Lucinda. Again, it's one of those funny quirks that we've always had a complicated relationship, first with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and with the WTO. What gets lost in that is its architecture is a U.S. architecture, right? The idea that you should have a set of international rules that are encourage non-discriminatory trade and lean in the favor of reducing barriers and offering people their economic freedom at the end of the day is a remarkably American impulse starting immediately after World War II. And it's flowed through as a consistent line in our trade policy. So again, it's one of those ironies that if you decide, the recent announcement of the president's trade agenda seems to imply, that you would ignore those rules, the odd thing is you're ignoring something that is quintessentially an American framework. It is designed in a way that actually has served our interests, and we're in the position economically as well as legally to take best advantage of it. Now, when I was at the Commerce Department, one thing I always thought about was our exporters. How do they engage in world trade? Well, the reality is when we are setting a set of rules internationally that are largely consistent with what happens in our own market because of the Commerce Clause under our Constitution, we actually are reducing the friction for American workers and firms to participate in the global economy. That's what the WTO is. So there's a lot of value there. I used to call this, in cosmological terms, the dark matter in the trade universe, because we talk a little bit about reducing the tariff levels, but the real value is the uncertainty you reduce and the friction you reduce with the rules. And so there's real value to what the WTO represents, again, as an American creation.
And a couple of points, Lucinda. The philosophy behind the WTO is to bring countries in, assuming that they will agree to a certain basic level of commitment. And the view is, whether it's bringing in China or more recently bringing in Russia, if they're not in the tent, then they have no obligations and there's no way to enforce any of the rules against them. So by bringing them in and utilizing the dispute settlement mechanisms at the WTO, the US and other countries have actually achieved quite a bit of market access they would not otherwise have. And so with 160 plus members today at the WTO, it's not easy to reach agreements. They've got to, they tend to be the lowest common denominator. Fortunately, we reached one on trade facilitation.
Right.
Again, to reduce
Very
friction,
important.
reduce friction at the borders.
Absolutely.
And that took a while, and then it took another couple of years for it to enter into force. But it has happened. So we're not talking really about a lot of agreements, but we're talking about ways to, again, create less friction and open up more opportunities for U.S. companies and workers.
Well, you raised the topic of China, and in fact, I wanted to turn next to China because it's been another big focus of attention with the new administration, and as with Mexico and the NAFTA, the Trump administration has really pointed to our trade deficit with China, as well as practices such as currency manipulation that it thinks indicate that we really made a mistake letting China into the WTO, and that we're being taken advantage of by China. So you've already anticipated in your answers some of previously some of these questions, but let's just talk about what the administration could do in response to some of these concerns if it continues to feel that they really are problems that need to be responded to.
So there are a lot of issues with China, but just to focus on a few. We don't have a trade agreement with China. So some of the concerns we have about lack of market access and lack of reciprocity, are hard to even address without a trade agreement. And I'm not suggesting we should have a trade agreement with China. It's just to keep that in mind. We don't
Right.
have the kind of obligations with China that we have with 20 other countries with which we trade closely. One of the issues is China's compliance with the WTO commitments that it did make. It has made a lot of progress where the U.S. government sees shortcomings. It has not been shy to prosecute cases at the WTO. The Obama administration brought more than any previous administration, and it may be that the Trump administration exceeds that record. We shall see. Everyone's in favor of strong enforcement of existing obligations, whether they're bilateral or whether they're multilateral at the WTO.
Grant, what's your thought about that?
Again, it's a contract, and you expect your trading partners to live up to the obligations where they don't. I mean, if one thing we have a comparative advantage in this country, it's lawyers. I mean, the idea that we couldn't conceive
Sitting right here.
of creative ways to go about this. Let me give you a concrete example. There is a Chinese exporter, state-owned, that has amassed a great pile of aluminum in Mexico. And it's done so by lying about various representations of the Commerce Department and Customs. There are tools, including a RICO case, to go after that. That targeted sort of enforcement is due because there are individual Chinese entities that are operating in ways that are inconsistent with the agreements we've reached. Having said that, the focus, for example, on the bilateral trade deficit is the point where I always like to hold up my iPhone, because this is 65% US content. So when you think about that deficit, it's an artifact of some customs rules of origin that claim this entire product is Chinese because it's the place it was assembled. So when I think about that trade deficit and what this phone represents, the number is far smaller than critics of our trade policy and our trade agreements like to reach. And to Miriam's point, the basic framework we have in the WTO with respect to China is incomplete. No one would argue that there wouldn't be a better round of competition policy areas that we haven't covered that really would address what is essentially an economy of state-owned enterprises. Right. So there are things we should be thinking about. To me, there's two ways to do that. One is in the WTO. The other was the TPP. The interesting thing about the TPP, which is not often said, is that the most important part of it was bargaining with Vietnam. Why? China won't be pushed, but it can be invited. And one of the ways you invite it is by Vietnam outcompeting China for investment. And that's what the rules would have encouraged. At which point, those folks in Shanghai, who are part of the princeling generation that are interested in economic reform, would have used that as a point within their own political councils to start to move China in a liberalizing direction. We'll see what comes out of the summit between President Trump and President Xi at Mar-a-Lago. But what I expect is there will be a point of continuing friction over this because of the sorts of statements that were made in the context of the campaign. But my point is there are tools that the law gives us, both internationally and domestically, which we can use to address the individual issues with China, and we are fully capable of making use of those tools. The question is, can we do that? And frankly, do it in a way that avoids outright retaliation by China as a part of this enterprise.
Because we do have to think about what comes next if we do things.
Always.
Well, Grant's talked about the TPP and if I'm hearing you, the lost opportunity to influence China's behavior from outside. And we know China's negotiating its own multilateral agreement, the RCEP, I think it's called. Miriam,
Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
What's that going to mean for us?
Well, let me just say, because we've been tiptoeing around this. Unfortunately, the decision to withdraw from the TPP that the administration made in its first few days without an opportunity to review it and see what it was they didn't like, what it was they did like, and what they could do about the former. In other words, could the agreement be improved, is unfortunately a gift to China. China is the largest beneficiary of the U.S. decision to pull out and to cede economic leadership in that vital and growing region to someone else. And by all indications, that someone else is China. So, perhaps in due course, the administration will take another look at this. I'm not suggesting that that will happen, but again, when you really boil this down to what is in the U.S. economic interest to do, I think that agreement is something that we've lost. And even though it wasn't perfect, it did set high standards that China might one day be able to meet, but certainly not in the foreseeable future. And for that reason, it had China very, very concerned.
Well, let me just push on this a little bit, because this was actually a point of agreement by both major candidates in the campaign that this agreement was flawed, and yet you look at it and there's cutting edge chapters on topics like corruption. So what's at the bottom of the concern here?
Well, for the president, I mean, one of the interesting things is that there is a lot of discussion about concern in the electorate about trade, but more often than not, in my experience, having dealt with both politics and the law of this, there's a tendency to read the election results to confirm the views you had before the election. And that's really the case here. The irony is that President Trump as a candidate started out thinking China was a part of the TPP, right, which he thought was its greatest flaw. The irony is it wasn't part of the TPP, so that wasn't a material flaw. And even in terms of specific areas like currency, for example, it offered a platform where you could build into a set of disciplines on a regional basis that net would have been helpful in terms of a conversation with China by establishing rules in what is the most economically dynamic region in the world economy. So the irony is, as Miriam said, it's a lost opportunity, and lost for the wrong reasons, honestly.
Yeah, because I think the new administration coming in, had they decided to take a review period, the other 11 parties were already so vested in seeing this agreement come into force that the new administration might well have been able to revisit certain issues. It would have been complicated. Nobody would have been eager to reopen the text. But again, a new administration would have had, I think, the opportunity, if they wanted to try to get more concessions. But that opportunity is now lost for the time being.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, Miriam, because even on the issue of currency, I think as you look at both the WTO and the Articles Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, this falls in a crack between the two. And so, ironically, this is a moment where, as a matter of international law, you would want to sit down with your trading partners to adopt a set of rules that encourage the liberalization that both the IMF and the WTO were designed to achieve, rather than withdrawing from the conversation. Right? So the answer to issues of currency and currency manipulation in particular actually lies in engagement and crafting a set of rules that we're prepared to live with and want other countries to live with as well, rather than withdrawing from the conversation, in effect.
And that would have some enforcement mechanisms, as you pointed out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And as you point out, Lucinda, there's something called the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, spearheaded by China. It actually includes more parties than the TPP did, all the ASEAN members, plus a number of TPP partners, plus India, as well as China. And, there have been, I guess, some friendly competition at the time when both TPP and RCEP, forgive all the acronyms, were moving along. Who's going to finish first, sort of maybe like the tortoise and the hare. Well, now it looks like RCEP is slated to finish first. However, there's growing tension between China, who wants to hurry up and get it done with relatively low standards, and countries like Japan and Australia, who now don't have the TPP to create the higher standards and would like to see RCEP raise the level of ambition so that will actually, it'll mean something.
Yeah, I mean, the tradition in the region has been to not just the lowest common denominator, but really the least common denominator. It's one of those odd things where the RCEP itself is what I would describe as both narrower and less deep in terms of the legal obligations the parties would assume. So it's inconsistent with the idea of what you actually want in trade, going back to my point about the dark matter in the trade universe. What you really want are those set of rules that are reducing the friction in the system.
Right.
The transaction costs, the economists call it, right? And there's nothing about the RCEP that actually does that, particularly, as Miriam absolutely correctly points out, China wants to rush in with something that is doesn't represent a material step forward in terms of what you're trying to do trade-wise, but it does.
But they must think it's going to benefit them, and we're not part of it. Is that right?
Yeah, in the following sense, Lucinda, China's trying to push its companies up the value chain rather than forcing them to earn their way up the value chain, which is deeply unsettling for Malaysia and Thailand and Singapore and other countries in the region. The RCEP would give them the authority to do that, in effect, or give the opportunity to do more of that without the high standards that Japan and Australia are asking for. That's the point of friction, but you can see what happens then. Suddenly, if you get the RCEP in place, there is this centripetal force that begins to revolve around China rather than the model of an open international economy the United States would prefer and that we benefit from. I mean, one of the ironies about the trade debate is we happen to be the country best capable of taking advantage of globalization, in part because we're the diaspora. Right. We have all these links to the rest of the world, and we have a framework that we feel comfortable with legally, and that is our opportunity. And weirdly enough, it's institutionally in our comparative advantage. And so the irony is we're in a situation where China may create an institutional foundation to accomplish its economic objectives at our expense, and also Malaysia's expense, Singapore's expense, Thailand's expense. That can't be in our interest in the long term, economically or more broadly strategically, since trade is always a function of the larger relationships between states.
I just want to make a point about agreements in general and this notion of economic nationalism, economic sovereignty, because whether we're talking about international economic agreements or we're talking more broadly about other international agreements, there's this new idea that somehow we have to regain our sovereignty. Well, international lawyers know the very fact of reaching an agreement is an expression of sovereignty.
It's an act of sovereignty in and of itself. Absolutely.
It's not as if we have sovereignty to regain because we never lost it.
Exactly.
And so,
exactly right.
Any of the commitments that we've made as the United States, we have made willingly. It may be time to update them. There may be commitments we have that we want to revisit. There may be new commitments we want to forge, but it really shouldn't be seen as an aspect of somehow regaining our sovereignty.
Which is why I always stress it's a bargain.
Exactly.
Right. And if, like in any contract, if you feel events in your business have outpaced the terms and it no longer fits between you and suppliers or your landlord or whatever it is, you sit down, you renegotiate to try and make sure that the bargain reflects the economic circumstances you're in. That I grasp, right? The idea that you try and pull yourself apart because of an artificial notion of what sovereignty is represents a justification for what you intended to do to begin with, right? Now, from my perspective, when I think about trade and all the rules, I actually think about it in moral terms. It's designed to serve people at the bottom of our society and our economy. It's designed for the single mom from West Virginia who goes to Walmart on Labor Day to buy jeans and shoes for her kids. Our tariffs, our peak tariffs, lie on those things. Reducing those is a real benefit to the bottom. And that's true globally. So the idea that somehow economic nationalism represents an act of helping our country when we're hurting the people who are most in need of help in terms of their standard of living is one that's deeply perplexing to me, I have to say, because it seems inconsistent with what America's reach has always been in terms of to refine international law in ways that serve those interests.
And yet we're not the only ones thinking about these things. And if we look across the Atlantic Ocean for a moment, what we're seeing with the UK vote in Brexit is a decision of the people of that country via, a referendum, an expression of popular will to leave the European Union. I think based on some of the same kind of sentiments. Now that's an issue that's playing out between the UK and the EU, but what does it mean for us in terms of our economic and other relationships with both of those parties? Miriam, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure.
You maybe thought about this when you were in government or since?
Yeah, I've thought about this a little bit. Worked very hard on ways to try to bring the US and the EU even closer. Economically as well as in other aspects. I mean, had TPP gone forward and had TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, gone forward, then the U.S. would be sitting at the center of two major trading hubs and would really,
I agree.
be able to continue to set the rules of the road in a way that is advantageous to the U.S. economy. This idea of putting America first is a good one because it's been our policy for a long time. It's also, though, the policy of other countries. No leader is going to put his country second or her country second.
Right.
And that goes back to Grant's point about how when countries come to the table, you've got to find a win-win scenario. With regard to Europe right now, it's going through a time of tremendous change. I mean, there are elections today in the Netherlands,
right.
and we should know soon how they come out. But this wave of populism is obviously spreading through Europe. We saw it in the U.S. It's much more of a reflection of a number of anxieties in Europe, in particularly due to increased immigration. Here too, as well. But I think that issue has gotten even more attention in European countries because of the major influxes that some of them have seen. And so we saw the vote in June in the UK to leave the EU, and Prime Minister May is likely relatively soon to formally invoke Article 50, which is notice in an official way that the relationship is ending. And then there's about a 2-year period in which the UK can negotiate with the EU on what the terms of exit are and hopefully also what the new relationship will look like. There are a lot of US companies and global companies that we work with that are very concerned about this playing out in a less than helpful way. The EU negotiations with the UK are not going to be easy. The UK also wants to do a bilateral trade agreement with the US and with other countries to try to soften the blow. Prime Minister May was the first official visitor that the president had at the White House. She's very eager to start. It is hard to start a formal trade negotiation with the UK as long as they are part of the EU because you don't know what the contour of that relationship is going to look like.
Right.
What will their tariff schedule be? What will they look like in terms of any kind of special relationship with the EU that would affect the extent to which the US can forge a trade agreement? So we actually, with the EU today, have the largest bilateral trading partnership in the world. UK is a significant piece of that, but even so, it's going to remain the US-EU relationship economically and politically and strategically a very important one. So it's going to take a little while for these issues to work themselves out. And in the meantime, there's a lot of uncertainty, which isn't helpful.
So in interest of full disclosure, I'm part of a group that's advising the British government about post-Brexit trade arrangements. And I guess if I could say the counterpoint to this, looking for the silver lining at this point, because I wouldn't have advised Great Britain to leave the EU, given the close ties. But now that they've made that decision, there's a couple of things that are really interesting, including from a U.S. perspective. First thing is, you now have the opportunity to bargain with the 5th largest economy in the world. This is one that matters. It's not like we're negotiating with the outer asteroid belt over trade where there's very little commercial benefit from the U.S. perspective. There's real commercial benefit. In the financial sector alone, which is about to be shocked by a revolution in technology, it makes a lot of sense for the United States and the UK to be sitting down and talking about what that means, both in terms of liberalizing so that you're encouraging competition and innovation rather than saving incumbents from that competition, and also in terms of a regulatory framework, because that will have to change in the face of the technological revolution as well. There's value there. Also, from the UK's perspective, one of the interesting things about being part of a larger framework that is a customs union rather than a free trade agreement, it means that you are bound by the tariffs of the whole. The irony is you're buying into the protectionist interest of every other member country.
Right.
So when you look at the UK's tariff schedule, one of the things that you could do is offer a tax cut to the folks at the bottom in the UK, a down payment, if you were, by getting rid of tariffs on oranges, which are designed to help farmers in Spain. But UK doesn't grow oranges. So there's a series of things where they could actually reduce a lot of costs in the system and put that on the bargaining table with the United States as well. Now, from a U.S. perspective, it is one of those things that if the administration wants to adopt a bilateral approach, here's your golden opportunity. So
Right.
if you want to get on the front foot, yeah, and this is the great point I think Miriam was making, is that the progress you were making on both the transatlantic account and the TPP was something that was profound, both in terms of assuming the benchmark of the WTO and reaching beyond it and
Right.
elaborating other
Right.
international legal principles as part of a bargain. In this instance, you have that opportunity again, since the administration has set, at least TPP aside for the moment. I don't know where it will go on the transatlantic partnership, but it doesn't look positive, I guess, is the right way to put it.
A ray of hope.
Yes, but this is one of those opportunities where you'd say, seize it as quickly as you can, because it's a chance to actually get back on the foot of engaging. And the odd thing is that whether it's in the international legal system on human rights, the environment, climate change, anything on the economic front, if the United States isn't at the table, our interests aren't served. And we've come in very close to not being at the table to vindicate our interests as a part of this discussion. So I think, and it seems to be the instinct of the administration reflexively, but I would think it would be very shrewd to get on a positive foot, and the UK represents that opportunity. And having said that, that's with the caveat that I would not have encouraged the UK to get out of the EU in the first instance, but we're now dealing with a situation where they are.
Well, we know Brexit means Brexit.
Brexit, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So here we go. I want to come back to some of the U.S. trade policy decisions that are pending now, and there's been some discussion about unilateral measures,
Yes.
such as tariffs
Yep.
in the context of NAFTA, but even
Absolutely.
more broadly,
Yep.
there's a lot of concern about companies that are exporting jobs. Miriam talked
Right.
about jobs earlier, but making border tax adjustments to favor companies that export, and conversely penalizing those that import. We don't know at this point what's going to come out of the legislative hopper, but I'd like to talk about these from the standpoint of international
Right.
law in particular. Are these things we can do? Are we permitted to do under the rules that we're currently bound by? Grant, you've thought a lot about tax policy over the years. I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, let's start with the tariff side. So the president, under a series of Cold War delegations of authority, can claim there's an international emergency and raise tariffs. So the prospect is there in terms of a tool that's available. Those actions would violate all of our trade agreements, and we would be subject to retaliation as a consequence. Probably more profoundly on the tax side, what we're witnessing is something that I think is actually a function of the strength of the WTO rules. When I was up in the boundary waters in those days in Minnesota and being a canoe guide, it's amazing how the water would move around the rocks rather than trying to confront the rocks, right? Well, the WTO rules have enough strength that countries are looking for other ways to achieve mercantilist purposes. The tax debate is not just one that's about tax reform in the United States. Countries that have deficits because of the response to the financial crisis in 2008, trying to find a way to close those deficits by getting more revenue. And so it's true of EU decisions about state aid. It's true of Mexican decisions about denying value-added tax refunds to encourage American companies to invest more in Mexico. This is actually what I would describe as the rise of the new tax mercantilism. And I'd be very concerned if the approach eventually adopted by the Congress was something that contributed to that. Because then we're trying to get outside the boundaries of the trading system's rules in a way. And as I made the point earlier, those rules have real value, particularly with the people that need them at the bottom of our society. So there's a deep concern about that. Now, the context of the actual proposal that the House has put forward, there's really too little detail. There's been a rush, it's the classic thing in Washington of we get used to what I describe as motivated reasoning. You start with the outcome you want, and then you reason back to your analysis. Well, right now there's insufficient detail to actually say whether the outcome will conflict or be consistent with the WTO rules. It will all be in the implementation, which we're a long ways from at this point. But this is one of those really interesting things about the value of international law generally. It is actually shaping our political process in a way that it should. We bargained for these rules because they were in our interests. We want to adhere to them because that's in our interests if other countries do the same. So as we think about tax, there's no doubt in my mind that this will shape the thinking on the Ways and Means Committee. Certainly will shape the thinking on the Senate, which is a completely different set of politics. And I'm assuming that the bill comes out of that process going to be something that really does reflect a lot of thought about the nature of what we get from the trading system. Therefore, we want to make sure we comply at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, without the global rules of the road that we have by virtue of the WTO and other global institutions, it's a free-for-all. It's a Wild West. And that does not serve U.S. interests. And furthermore, if we were to step outside of those institutions, we would have no ability to influence what they were doing
Exactly
and
right.
to keep them moving in a positive direction. So as we look at these questions of punitive tariffs or the border adjustment tax known as the BAT, there is a lot of lack of details and understanding about what this really is. Every time you ask someone to describe it, there's a different description. Maybe that's a good thing. I think at the moment that's a good thing. And I think, you know, and the White House hasn't taken a clear position. They haven't gone to bat for the BAT, and they haven't said they oppose it. They did initially, but then they walked back from that. So there's a big question mark over the border adjustment tax, but I think it is, like Grant said, a very positive development that people are truly concerned about what this would mean for our international obligations. On the question of punitive tariffs, yes, we have authorities under U.S. law. It can be used for certain periods of time. But again, we're looking at retaliation with regard to both measures. Other countries have made very clear, if there's a border tax, if there are punitive tariffs, they are ready to retaliate. And they can do things that will hurt our economy. And so the question is, how do we avoid a situation like that? How do we make the level playing field even more level? How do we fight unfair trade practices, but not do it in a way that comes back to spite us?
And just to be clear, retaliation is something that international law allows countries to do in certain circumstances when their interests are harmed. So this wouldn't
Absolutely.
be
Right.
and necessarily an illegal response.
Well,
that
if
we're
it's
talking about.
pursuant
You know
to
what?
the WTO, if we litigate and we win, and that's happened numerous times, and we have the right to retaliate if the other country doesn't bring themselves into compliance.
To go back to the point that both Miriam and I made earlier about this being a contract, and the reality is, if the Congress decides it wants to move in the direction of a border adjustable tax, now there are border adjustable taxes that are WTO consistent. So you could opt
It
for
is
that model.
possible.
It is
Okay.
possible. But the more profound thing is if you chose to do something, the only obligation is go renegotiate with your trading partners. Again, if you decide you have to do something in your own economic self-interest that is going to upset the balance of advantages you've agreed to as a part of the contract, your real obligation is to go back and sit down with your trading partner and say, let's reset the balance. What else should be on the table as a part of this? And then we'll be involved in a trade negotiation. But it's the perspective that we want the rules to bring. And I would say that's writ large. You know, at the end of the day, what I always think about international law and what I think ASIL always represents, Lucinda, is the very notion that we are better under a system of laws, that we are better under a system of avoiding disputes. Within that system, the solvency of our word and the commitment to adhere to the rule of law is a really powerful force. That serves us in terms of our diplomacy, serves us in keeping the peace, and it serves our economic interests. And so coming back to vindicate that in everything we do, and even to see how it might shape the tax debate, it's actually a very positive thing, because that's the value of international law.
So I want to go to our last real topic in this discussion, and it's an important one, and that is, I mean, we've talked about, you know, national interest. We've talked about trade agreements as an exercise of sovereignty. We've talked about the benefits of the bargains, but the question is really, should there be a new paradigm for thinking about these agreements? And I read a very interesting op-ed in the Financial Times a few days ago about whether Trump's trade policy would help, you know, those people at the bottom of the economic ladder, or the people who lost their jobs in Ohio. And let me just quote a sentence for you and ask for your thoughts. The sentence that caught my eye is, quote, "The fact that economic globalization has run well ahead of political globalization means that the current system serves the interest of wealthy companies and individuals more than the electorate of any particular nation. Miriam, what do you think about that?
Well, Lucinda, I think that, as we saw during the election here, and we're seeing in elections in other countries, there's a real sense that the economies, and trade is part of the economy, are not working for the people in the bottom half. And so the challenge is, in the US, how do we fix that situation? We shouldn't have 20% of children living in poverty. The Federal Reserve did a study not that long ago asking families whether they could handle an emergency $400 expense. And nearly half of the families surveyed were either going to have to borrow the money or sell something. Right. So, this is not an acceptable situation. And then the question is, what do we do? Well, reforming the US tax code is something that I think, in theory, just about everybody agrees on. But we don't want a situation where individual rates on the wealthiest are coming down, because that's not going to help with this growing income disparity that we see, and not help those closer to the bottom take advantages of opportunities to lift themselves up. So again, trade's been a scapegoat. We have to try to differentiate what trade is responsible for and where trade agreements and trade enforcement can improve. But I also think we have to be honest about the discussion, and this notion that trade benefits only wealthy companies and individuals is not quite true. I mean, they certainly do benefit in the sense that they have the resources to operate globally, but they also have the resources to do that without trade agreements. So in a sense, trade agreements actually help the small, medium enterprises that are the backbone of the US economy, because they don't on their own have the resources or the confidence to go into new markets without the backing of the US government behind them.
And Grant, you talked about the single mother who shops at Walmart. I'm interested in your thoughts on
this.
this.
This is one of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt is my hero, because he was wise enough to know that trade liberalization, in those days, Republicans would come in office and raise tariffs sky high. Largely, it was the Ohio bloc in the Republican Party that would bring this about. Brought us McKinley tariff, the whole thing. And Roosevelt was smart enough, shrewd enough, to not only know that the right thing to do morally as well as economically, particularly in the context of the Depression, was to negotiate reciprocal trade agreements, drop the tariffs, because it would benefit the people at the bottom when they most needed it. He also knew enough to break the political machine in Ohio. And the importance of that is that it is not that difficult, this is my experience from the Finance Committee, to find a way to do the right thing in a way that's consistent with good politics. And it seems to me that we've gotten caught up in thinking about this completely the wrong way, right? I mean, trade is a powerful thing. So the premise is actually wrong. If you think about Walmart, which is often vilified, but it delivers a cost savings from the globe to the poorest people in our society on a daily basis throughout this country. Now, you can say political governance has not kept pace. I think we would agree with that in many respects as international lawyers as an abstract theme. But at the same time, the premise that it's companies that are somehow taking advantage of the system at the expense is not quite true, because a lot of them actually deliver value for that single mom in West Virginia. Now, how do we, under our circumstance, try and make sure that our politics honors that? It's good morally as well as good politically, could also be shrewd politically, right? But how do we honor that at the same time, address the other sorts of things? And one of the interesting things about this, and I wrote a book about this a couple of years ago, which is that so much of what we're confronting as a country cannot be addressed through trade policy, right? The sorts of things that we really have to come to grips with economically that Miriam pointed out in terms of how we care for society and make every child the author of their future, free of any orthodoxy, prejudice, or any limit on what they can do, their freedom, equality of opportunity. That's not actually something trade can do other than simply trying to liberalize tariffs and end discrimination economically. There's a lot of other things we have to do as a society to allow us to compete globally. And those things will actually help address some of the disciplines I think that the author in the Financial Times is pointing to. But that starts at home. And when we have a model at home we feel comfortable as addressing those things, we should find a way to reach out and translate it into the international sphere, international law.
They have to be done in tandem. I mean,
Yes, absolutely.
just forging a strong trade policy consistent with all of the issues that we've outlined today would be an important step, but
Not enough.
it's
Absolutely.
not nearly enough. It's
Miriam's
just a
absolutely right.
piece. And also, and if the president does want to craft a thoughtful trade policy focusing both on opportunities and enforcement, then I think there's actually going to be a great deal of bipartisan support, because progressive Democrats agree with the Trump administration on many trade issues, and it's more moderate Republicans and more conservative Democrats that they're going to have to talk to. And it's not so much about the goals. I think everybody agrees on those. It's more, how are you going to get there?
I agree.
Well, I hope that's right. We've covered a lot of territory today, and we haven't even talked about technology except for
Yes,
e-commerce
exactly.
briefly. And so there's more we could do. But this has been a very useful discussion. And some of the things I'm taking away are that we ought to be thinking about refining our tools and our information a little bit. Very interesting discussion from both of you, I think, about trade deficits and how we
Right.
need to unpack those and get a real picture of the economic
sure.
activity that's going on, and then how to think more forcefully about what the benefits are, both in the tariff and the non-tariff area of a rule-based system. And those are things that we in the American society
Absolutely.
can take on to do some thinking about. So let me thank you both
Thank you.
for a very useful dialogue. And with that, I'll turn it back to Mark.
Thank you, Lucinda, and thanks to our speakers for participating in this program. I'd also like to express my appreciation to the staff of the American Society of International Law. Please join us for our next webcast on Wednesday, April 5th at 11:30 a.m. Eastern, 3:30 GMT, when we will present an expert discussion on international law and the environment. You can register at www.asil.org/100days. If you'd like to see this program again or missed any of the early programs in this series, you can find them at that link together with related resources, including our free publication, International Law: 100 Ways It Shapes Our Lives. All are available to the public at no charge, and we invite you to view them and to share them with friends and colleagues. Again, that web page is www.asil.org/100days. And finally, if you've enjoyed this program, we invite you to consider becoming a member of the Society and registering for our annual meeting, which will take place in Washington on April 12th through 15th. The meeting will include over 30 panels and keynote events, including a special series of programs that will continue this discussion of international law and the new U.S. administration. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.